Before the British Empire learned to fear her name, she was a young queen living in a kingdom they believed they could quietly erase. That was the first mistake. Because empires are often defeated long before battle begins. Sometimes the downfall starts with arrogance. A signature on a document. A dismissive laugh in a political office. A powerful man looking at somebody smaller and deciding they are not a threat. The British looked at the Kingdom of Jhansi and saw vulnerability. A widowed queen, an adopted child, a small princely state standing before one of the most powerful empires on earth. What they did not see was the woman history would later remember as Rani Lakshmibai. And by the time they realized who she truly was, northern India was already burning. The strange thing about legends is that they rarely begin looking legendary. Rani Lakshmibai was not born into some prophecy. No ancient priest pointed at the sky and declared she would become immortal in history. She entered the world in 1828 as Manikarnika Tambe in the holy city of Varanasi, during a time when the British East India Company was tightening its grip across India like a hand slowly closing around a throat. India at the time was politically fragmented. Some kingdoms allied with the British. Others resisted them. Some rulers tried to negotiate survival. Others watched helplessly as territory after territory disappeared into imperial control. And meanwhile, a little girl nicknamed Manu was growing up with absolutely no intention of becoming ordinary. Even as a child, she did not fit neatly into expectations. She learned horseback riding, sword fighting, military training, archery. Accounts describe her as intelligent, fearless, energetic, and unusually independent. While society expected many girls of noble background to focus primarily on etiquette and domestic responsibilities, Manu reportedly preferred physical training and adventure. And honestly, the image feels almost cinematic in retrospect. Because somewhere in India, while British officials were drawing borders and calculating profits, a future nightmare for the empire was learning how to fight. She lost her mother at a young age, which shaped much of her upbringing. Her father raised her in an environment where she had more freedom than many girls of her time. She reportedly spent time around scholars, soldiers, and political discussions. She was not being molded into fragility. She was being molded into resilience. Eventually, she married Maharaja Gangadhar Rao Newalkar, the ruler of Jhansi, and became Lakshmibai, Queen of Jhansi. For a moment, it seemed as though her life had settled into royal stability. But history has a way of circling people destined for turbulence. The royal couple suffered devastating personal loss when their infant son died shortly after birth. The grief reportedly shattered the Maharaja emotionally and physically. His health began declining rapidly afterward. And then came the decision that would unknowingly place Jhansi directly in the crosshairs of the British Empire. Shortly before his death, the Maharaja adopted a young boy named Damodar Rao as his heir. This was not unusual within many Indian royal traditions. Adoption had long been recognized as a legitimate method for continuing royal succession. But the British East India Company saw an opportunity. At the time, Governor-General Lord Dalhousie had been aggressively expanding British territory through a policy called the Doctrine of Lapse. And this policy was almost disturbingly simple. If an Indian ruler died without what the British considered a legitimate biological male heir, the company could annex the kingdom. No heir, no kingdom. Convenient, isn't it? It was colonialism disguised as administration. The British refused to recognize Damodar Rao's claim to the throne, which meant Jhansi was now theirs. At least, according to them. And this is where the story changes. Because many rulers in similar situations reluctantly accepted British decisions. Some negotiated pensions. Some surrendered political authority to avoid bloodshed. Some realized resistance against the British Empire was practically impossible. But Rani Lakshmibai refused. According to popular legend, she declared, "I shall not surrender my Jhansi." Whether the exact wording survives perfectly through history almost does not matter anymore. The sentence became larger than historical verification. It became symbolic. And symbols are dangerous, especially during times of unrest. The British likely expected political frustration. What they got instead was a woman slowly transforming into a revolutionary icon. For several years, tensions simmered beneath the surface. Lakshmibai petitioned British authorities, argued for recognition of her adopted son, and attempted diplomatic resistance. But the company had little interest in compromise. Jhansi was strategic. Jhansi was profitable, and empires are rarely sentimental about the people standing in the way of expansion. Then came 1857, and suddenly, everything exploded. Indian soldiers serving under the British East India Company began rebelling across northern India. The causes were layered and complicated. Religious tensions, economic exploitation, political annexations, cultural resentment, military grievances. Years of anger finally erupted all at once. Some British accounts referred to it as the Sepoy Mutiny. Many Indians later called it the First War of Independence. Whatever name people choose, the reality was chaos. Cities turned violent, British families fled, soldiers mutinied, kingdoms chose sides, trust collapsed, and in the middle of this storm stood Jhansi. One of the reasons historians continue debating Lakshmibai's story is because the early phase of the rebellion around Jhansi remains deeply controversial. During the uprising, several British residents in Jhansi were killed by rebel forces. British narratives often implied Lakshmibai was responsible or complicit. Indian narratives frequently portrayed her as trapped within uncontrollable circumstances. The truth remains historically debated. And honestly, that uncertainty adds another layer to her legend. Because history becomes most emotionally charged when nobody completely agrees. What is clear is that after these events, the relationship between Lakshmibai and the British became irreparable. There was no returning to negotiation anymore, only war, and the British were coming. At this point, it is important to understand just how terrifying the British military machine seemed during the 19th century. This was not merely an army. This was an empire with industrial resources, trained officers, artillery, logistics, international wealth, and expanding global dominance. The British had conquered territories across continents. And now they were preparing to crush resistance in India. Meanwhile, Lakshmibai began strengthening Jhansi's defenses. She organized troops, fortified positions, gathered allies, prepared weapons, and perhaps most remarkably, she inspired loyalty. That part matters more than people realize. Because rulers can command obedience through fear, but inspiring people to fight beside you against overwhelming odds, that requires something else entirely. By early 1858, British forces under Sir Hugh Rose marched toward Jhansi. The siege began soon afterward, and this is where the story becomes almost unbearably intense. Imagine the atmosphere inside the fort. Cannons roaring against ancient walls, smoke swallowing the skyline, families trapped inside, food supplies shrinking, every explosion reminding the defenders that one of the most powerful empires in the world wanted them crushed. And somewhere in the middle of that chaos was Lakshmibai, not hidden away in luxury, not fleeing, fighting. Accounts from the time describe her moving among soldiers, coordinating defenses, and refusing surrender despite impossible circumstances. British reports themselves acknowledged her leadership abilities, though often through the bitter lens of an enemy forced to respect someone they were trying to destroy. The siege intensified daily, bombardments shattered defenses, casualties mounted, the city descended into horror, and yet Jhansi continued resisting. There is something psychologically fascinating about moments like this in history, because eventually survival instincts usually overpower ideals. Most people reach a breaking point where fear becomes stronger than courage. But certain individuals seem to become sharper under pressure. Lakshmibai appeared to be one of them. And then came the moment that transformed her from historical figure into near mythology. The escape from Jhansi. According to legendary accounts, as British forces breached defenses and defeat became unavoidable, Lakshmibai escaped the fort at night on horseback with her adopted son secured to her back. Think about how powerful that image is. A queen riding through darkness while an empire closes in behind her. A mother protecting a child while carrying the collapse of a kingdom on her shoulders. It sounds less like ordinary history and more like something carved into folklore. Some details vary depending on the source. Different retellings exaggerate certain aspects over time. But regardless of embellishment, the escape became immortal in Indian memory. And perhaps the reason people connected so deeply with it is because the image represents more than survival. It represents refusal. Refusal to be captured. Refusal to surrender. Refusal to disappear quietly. After escaping Jhansi, Lakshmibai joined forces with rebel leaders including Tatya Tope. And this is where her story becomes even more extraordinary. Because she did not stop fighting after losing her kingdom. Many rulers would have vanished into exile. Many nobles would have tried to negotiate personal safety. Many leaders would have accepted defeat after witnessing the destruction of everything they ruled. Lakshmibai continued the war. That persistence is what elevated her from resistance leader into legend. Because courage during victory is inspiring. Courage after devastating loss becomes unforgettable. As the rebellion spread and shifted, rebel forces eventually captured the strategic city of Gwalior. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that the anti-British resistance might regain momentum. But the British were relentless. They advanced toward Gwalior with overwhelming force. And Lakshmibai prepared for battle once again. Now imagine the emotional exhaustion she must have carried by this point. She had lost her husband, lost her kingdom, endured siege warfare, witnessed death and destruction, become one of the most wanted figures in the rebellion, and still she continued riding into battle. That level of determination almost stops feeling human after a certain point. It begins feeling symbolic. Then came June 1858, the final battle. Accounts of her death vary in detail, but most agree she fought dressed in warrior attire and was fatally wounded during combat near Kota Ki Serai, close to Gwalior. Some stories claim she fought until her final breath. Others say loyal followers carried her away after she was injured. Several accounts suggest her body was cremated quickly to prevent British troops from capturing it. And honestly, even the uncertainty surrounding her death feels strangely fitting. Because legends rarely leave behind clean endings. She died at around 29 years old. 29. It is almost absurd to think somebody so young created a legacy powerful enough to echo for centuries. Even British officers who fought against her reportedly acknowledged her bravery. Sir Hugh Rose later described her as one of the most dangerous rebel leaders and praised her courage. And there is something deeply ironic about that. The empire that tried to erase her helped immortalize her instead. After the rebellion was crushed, the British tightened control over India. The East India Company itself was eventually dissolved, and direct crown rule began. But even though the rebellion failed militarily, something had changed forever. Resistance now had martyrs. Resistance had symbols. And few symbols burned brighter than Rani Lakshmibai. Over time, she evolved beyond history into national mythology. Poems celebrated her, paintings glorified her, children learned stories about the Queen of Jhansi from generation to generation. Freedom fighters during India's independence movement later invoked her name as a symbol of anti-colonial resistance. And what is fascinating is how her image survived across radically different periods of Indian history. Empires changed, politics changed, technology changed, but the warrior queen endured. Because some figures stop belonging to their own era, they become emotional landmarks. And perhaps what makes Lakshmibai's story so compelling is not merely that she fought. It is why people believe she fought. Not for conquest, not for expansion, but because somebody attempted to take away her home, her child's future, and her sovereignty. That emotional core still resonates today, especially in a world where people continue struggling against systems more powerful than themselves. And maybe that is why the image of Lakshmibai on horseback remains so haunting. Because deep down, people are drawn to stories about impossible resistance. About individuals who stare at overwhelming power and say no. The British believed Jhansi would become another administrative acquisition, another territory absorbed into imperial machinery, another kingdom quietly folded into empire. Instead, they created one of the most enduring legends in Indian history. A queen who transformed personal tragedy into political defiance. A ruler who became a warrior. A woman the empire underestimated. And centuries later, the world still remembers her name. Not because she won, but because she refused to surrender. And maybe that's what makes Rani Lakshmibai unforgettable. Not just the battles, not just the rebellion, not even the empire she stood against, but the fact that when history tried to corner her, she refused to kneel. Centuries later, her story still survives like a flame that never completely went out. And honestly, some legends are remembered because they ruled, but Rani Lakshmibai is remembered because she fought. Thank you for watching Ancient Gossip. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and turn on notifications because history has far more drama than people realize. And now I want to hear from you. Which historical figure should Ancient Gossip uncover next?